It is August 14th, 2026, and 2 days ago, a senior officer inside Iran's Revolutionary Guard said something out loud that Western intelligence agencies have apparently been quietly bracing for since February. He did not say it in a leaked memo. He did not say it to a foreign journalist who might soften the translation. He said it on Iranian state television, in Farsi, to his own population, which means he wanted it heard. Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Nagdi, senior advisor to the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, announced that Iran's military doctrine has officially shifted from defensive to offensive, and that the Revolutionary Guard has been formally tasked with developing the capability to conduct operations on enemy soil far from Iran's own borders. He did not name a country by accident. Enemy soil, in the vocabulary the IRGC has used consistently since February, means one place first and every place after that. It means the United States. Let's sit with what actually happened here, because the headline version of this story is already racing across social media in a form that strips out the nuance that makes it either more alarming or less alarming, depending on which detail you're missing. Nagdi's exact words, translated from Farsi and confirmed independently by Iranian state outlet Tabnak, were that the Guard must be able to take operations into enemy territory, into the enemy's lands, and carry out that work far from Iran's own territory. He called this the defining feature of an offensive doctrine. And he said the IRGC has now been formally ordered to build that readiness so that the capability exists whenever the order to use it is given. That is not a threat to attack tomorrow. It is something arguably more significant than a threat to attack tomorrow. It is an institution announcing, on the record, that its own internal posture has changed, and that from this point forward, planning for operations outside the Middle East is now a stated military objective rather than a contingency buried in a classified annex somewhere in Tehran. The same week, a second IRGC official, spokesperson Mohebi, went further in a separate address in the city of Qom. He said that if new threats against the Islamic Republic materialize, Iran's response would not be confined to military targets. He specifically named energy transit infrastructure, power grids, and internet-connected systems as vulnerable, and he claimed that hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines and thousands of power plants, both American and non-American, fall within the theoretical reach of what Iran now considers fair retaliatory ground. Whether Iran currently possesses the operational capability to make good on that claim at scale is a separate question from whether Iranian officials are now saying it publicly on state television as policy. They are. That's new. That's the story underneath the story. Markets noticed before most people scrolling their phones did. Brent crude rose more than 1% in the hours after the doctrine announcement, closing near $89 a barrel. U.S. crude followed the same direction. Global equities dipped, which by this point in the year has become an almost mechanical reflex every time the words Strait of Hormuz and doctrine appear in the same news cycle. Traders are not reacting to a single tweet, they are reacting to a pattern, and the pattern is that every time Tehran escalates its declared posture, the price of moving oil through the Gulf ticks upward, and every time it does, the diplomatic window that everyone from Doha to Washington has been trying to hold open for months gets a little narrower. And that timing is not incidental. This doctrine shift landed in the same week that reporting out of the region described the Hormuz peace track as effectively collapsing. For months, American and Iranian negotiators have been working through Qatari and Omani intermediaries to convert the ceasefire framework from earlier this year into something durable, something that actually survives contact with the hardline factions inside the IRGC, who were never fully on board with the negotiated settlement in the first place. An offensive doctrine announcement made on state television days after talks reportedly started falling apart, is not a coincidence of scheduling. It's a signal, and signals in this conflict have consistently meant something. Every time diplomacy has stalled since February, the military rhetoric out of Tehran has hardened almost immediately afterward, as if the hardline security establishment is using the collapse of each negotiating window as license to reassert itself. To understand why this particular announcement carries the weight it does, you have to go back to where this entire war began, because nothing that's happening in August makes sense without February sitting underneath it. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran, targeting nuclear infrastructure, missile production sites, and the senior leadership of the Islamic Republic simultaneously. The opening strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of senior officials, in what American officials would later describe as a decapitation operation built on years of accumulated intelligence. The war that followed has run for nearly 6 months now. It has pulled in Israel, the Gulf states, shipping lanes responsible for roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply, and at various points nearly every major power with a stake in the region. Iran did not simply absorb the opening strike and negotiate, it retaliated with missiles and drones across multiple countries, closed the Strait of Hormuz to what it called unfriendly shipping, and has spent the months since alternating between ceasefire commitments and violations of those same commitments. The man now sitting atop the Islamic Republic, the one whose guard just announced this new offensive doctrine, is Ali Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. He was elected supreme leader by Iran's Assembly of Experts within days of his father's death, and here is the detail that almost never makes it into the confident, declarative headlines about Iranian military threats. Mojtaba Khamenei was gravely wounded in the same February 28th strike that killed his father. This is not speculation or wartime rumor. It has been confirmed independently by multiple sources, including a New York Times report citing unnamed Iranian officials, and separately by U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who told reporters at the Pentagon that Iran's new leader is wounded and likely disfigured. According to the Times report, one of his legs was operated on 3 times, and he remains dependent on a prosthetic. He underwent surgery on one hand and is still slowly regaining function in it. His face and lips were severely burned in the attack, to the point that speaking is reportedly difficult for him, and doctors have told associates he will eventually need reconstructive surgery. He has not appeared in public since taking the position. Not once. Every statement attributed to him has come either as a written message or as words read aloud by a state television anchor on his behalf. Access to him is described as extremely limited, restricted for security reasons that anyone watching this war closely can understand immediately. Guard commanders reportedly do not visit him in person. Messages are passed by hand. And according to the same reporting, he had, at least for a period, delegated a significant share of day-to-day decision-making to generals inside the Revolutionary Guard's ideological command structure, because his own physical condition made hands-on command difficult to sustain. President Trump, when asked directly in March whether he believed Khamenei's son was even still alive, said he thought he probably was, but added that he believed the man was damaged. That is the sitting head of state of the country that just announced a formal shift toward offensive operations on American soil. Wounded, largely unseen, reportedly reliant on his own military command structure to translate policy into action. Why does that matter for how you should actually interpret this week's doctrine announcement? Because it raises the single most important question underneath this entire story, and it is a question almost nobody discussing this online is asking out loud. Who is actually making this decision? Is this doctrine shift something Mojtaba Khamenei personally reviewed, understood, and authorized from wherever he is currently being kept, with his injuries and his limited communication channels? Or is it something that originated inside the Revolutionary Guard's own command structure, drafted and announced by the generals who have reportedly been running significant portions of Iranian state decision-making since the earliest weeks of the war, using the authority of a supreme leader title that a wounded, largely invisible man currently holds but may not be fully exercising? Those are 2 very different stories. One is a deliberate, centrally authorized strategic pivot by Iran's head of state. The other is a hardline military bureaucracy consolidating its own operational independence and dressing it up in the language of supreme authority. Because a functioning chain of command requires someone at the top who can be pointed to, even if that someone is not the one actually steering. This is not a new pattern for the Islamic Republic in this war. Since February, the gap between what Iran's formal leadership says and what its Revolutionary Guard actually does on the ground has widened repeatedly. Ceasefire terms have been agreed to in Doha and violated within the Gulf within days. Diplomatic officials have described progress in talks, while IRGC-linked vessels continued harassing shipping in the Strait. If the pattern holds here, the offensive doctrine announcement is less a single unified decision from the top of the Iranian state, and more the latest and most explicit expression of an institution that has been operating with increasing autonomy since the day its supreme leader was wounded and driven into hiding. Let's talk for a moment about the phrase hybrid warfare, because Nagdi and other IRGC officials have used it deliberately, and it is not a throwaway term. In the language Iranian military officials have used publicly, the new offensive doctrine does not rest on missiles and drones alone. It combines military capability with diplomacy, propaganda, economic pressure, and what officials described as social resources, all pointed at the same set of objectives. That framing matters because it tells you Iran is not describing a single knockout capability it's racing to build. It's describing an approach that blends information warfare, economic leverage, and covert action alongside anything more conventional, which is exactly the kind of doctrine a state under sustained military and economic pressure adopts when it cannot compete symmetrically with a far larger power. Nagdi was explicit about the asymmetry. He acknowledged publicly that the American military budget dwarfs Iran's, by his own estimate roughly 100 times larger, but argued that the 14 objectives he said the United States and Israel set out to achieve against Iran had, in his telling, all failed. Whether that claim survives scrutiny is a separate question. The point is that Iran's own military leadership is explicitly framing its strategy going forward as one built around asymmetric, dispersed pressure rather than direct confrontation, and an offensive doctrine aimed at enemy soil is the external-facing extension of that same logic. It's also worth understanding that Iran does have a documented history of operations well beyond its own borders, which is part of why intelligence services take doctrine statements like this seriously rather than dismissing them as theater. Iran and its affiliated networks have been linked over the decades to attacks and plots far from the Middle East, including the 1994 bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, and to a long list of disrupted assassination and sabotage plots on European and North American soil in more recent years, several of which U.S. and allied intelligence agencies have publicly attributed to Iranian intelligence services or their proxies. None of that history means a new wave of attacks is coming. It means the capability and institutional muscle memory for covert operations outside the immediate region already exists inside Iran's security services, which is precisely why a doctrine statement formalizing that posture, rather than merely continuing it quietly, is being read by analysts as more significant than it might otherwise seem. Now let's talk about what operations on enemy soil could plausibly mean in the nearer term, because this is where the discussion needs discipline rather than adrenaline. Iran does not currently possess the capability to project conventional military force onto American territory in any traditional sense, and nothing in Nagdi's statement claimed otherwise. What Iran has demonstrated capability for, repeatedly, across decades, and reaffirmed throughout this war, is asymmetric reach. Cyber operations against infrastructure, support for proxy and affiliated networks abroad, and covert operations aimed at individuals rather than territory. The Mohebi statement about power grids and internet-connected systems fits squarely inside that category. It is a doctrine of disruption and deniability, not a doctrine of invasion. That distinction matters enormously for how seriously to weigh this news, because the plausible version of enemy soil operations looks like degraded infrastructure, disrupted networks, and targeted plots against individuals or facilities connected to the war, not landing forces or missile strikes on American cities. U.S. officials have not publicly responded in detail to Nagdi's specific remarks as of this recording, which, if this war has taught us anything, is itself sometimes the most informative signal available. Silence from Washington after an escalatory statement from Tehran has, throughout this conflict, often meant that the American government is either still assessing the credibility of the threat or already tracking something related to it that it has no interest in confirming publicly. It's also worth being honest about the parts of this story that are still moving and unconfirmed, because credibility is the entire point of doing this differently than the accounts that got called out for recycling stale or invented numbers. The specific framing of Nagdi's remarks first circulated widely through a single account on X, the Hormuz letter, before being picked up and independently reported by outlets including Tabnak inside Iran, Iranwire, and IB Times UK, all of which describe the same core claim in consistent language. That's a reasonably strong confirmation chain for a statement made on state television. What is not yet independently confirmed by Western intelligence assessments, at least not in anything public, is any specific plan, timeline, or operational detail behind the doctrine. Doctrine announcements are policy statements about intent and capability building. They are not operational orders, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of thing that turns a real, serious story into an exaggerated one that collapses the first time someone checks the sourcing. Here's the broader picture worth holding in your head as this develops. Iran's economy has been under extraordinary strain since February. Inflation has been running in the high double digits for months. The Strait of Hormuz, the corridor that under normal circumstances carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil trade, has been repeatedly closed, blockaded, and fought over, cutting deeply into the regime's own oil revenue at the exact moment it needs money to fund both a war and the domestic security apparatus required to manage internal unrest. Against that backdrop, a hardline doctrine announcement serves a purpose that has nothing to do with actual American soil. It is also a message to Iran's own population and to the hardline base inside the Guard itself, a demonstration of strength and defiance at a moment when the war is inflicting real, visible economic damage on ordinary Iranians. Governments under pressure escalate rhetoric for domestic audiences as often as they do for foreign ones, and any complete read of this moment has to hold both possibilities at once. This can be a genuine strategic pivot toward asymmetric global operations, and it can simultaneously be a projection of strength aimed inward at a population that is watching its currency collapse and its supreme leader remain invisible for the 6th straight month. There's a factional layer to this story too, and it's one that gets flattened almost every time this war gets covered in short-form video. The Islamic Republic is not, and has never been, a single unified voice issuing one coherent policy. There is a diplomatic wing, largely centered around President Masoud Pezeshkian's government, that has consistently signaled interest in negotiated de-escalation. because that wing understands better than anyone how close Iran's economy is to genuine collapse. And there is a hardline security wing, centered on the Revolutionary Guard's senior command, that has a direct institutional stake in the war continuing, because sanctions relief and a genuine peace settlement would very likely require exactly the kinds of concessions on missile programs, on regional proxy funding, on the Strait itself, that would strip the Guard of the leverage and the revenue streams that make it the most powerful institution inside the country. Every major escalation since February has followed roughly the same shape. The diplomatic wing makes progress in talks. The hardline wing responds with an action or statement that undercuts it. This week's doctrine announcement fits that shape precisely, arriving days after reports described the Hormuz talks as faltering from a Guard institution that benefits materially and politically from those talks continuing to falter. President Pezeshkian, notably, is a heart surgeon by training, and multiple reports over the course of this war have described him as personally involved in aspects of Mojtaba Khamenei's medical care and communication, given his own medical background and his position as one of the few officials with regular access to the wounded supreme leader. That detail sounds almost incidental until you consider what it implies about how thin the layer of people actually briefing Iran's head of state has become. When the president of the country is also functioning as one of the few trusted conduits to its supreme leader's sickbed, the institutional distance between formal Iranian policy and whatever the Revolutionary Guard's command structure decides to do in that policy's name gets even harder to measure from the outside. There's also the matter of what this does to the diplomatic track that was, as recently as a few weeks ago, showing at least fragments of genuine movement. Reporting on the state of Hormuz-related negotiations this week described the process as effectively cracking under the weight of these dueling signals, hardline military statements out of Tehran on one side, and an American administration that has shown little public patience for a negotiating partner it does not trust on the other. President Trump has said directly, in comments reported this month, that he does not trust the Islamic Republic and has accused its officials of lying to him during the process. When the country you're negotiating with announces a formal doctrine shift towards striking your own homeland in the same window that you're describing them as untrustworthy, the odds of that negotiation surviving intact drop considerably, regardless of what either side's stated intentions actually are. Zoom out for a second and look at the Strait of Hormuz numbers, because they explain why every doctrine statement out of Tehran moves oil markets within hours, regardless of how vague the underlying threat actually is. Before this war began, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through that single waterway. Since February, that flow has been repeatedly interrupted, first by Iran's own closure of the strait in retaliation for the opening strikes, then by a U.S.-led campaign to reopen it, then by an American naval blockade of Iranian ports that ran for roughly 6 weeks in the spring, and now by a Persian Gulf Transit Authority that Iran itself established in May to charge fees on shipping passing near its coast, an arrangement that the U.S. Treasury sanctioned within weeks, because officials assessed that the fees would flow directly back into IRGC coffers. Every one of those chapters shows the same underlying dynamic. The strait is not just a shipping lane in this conflict, it is Iran's single largest piece of economic leverage over the rest of the world. And every time, diplomacy threatens to take that leverage away permanently through sanctions relief tied to a lasting settlement, the institution that profits most from the strait remaining a pressure point has an obvious incentive to keep tensions elevated. That's the frame worth holding on to as you watch how the rest of this week unfolds. A doctrine statement about operations on enemy soil does not have to be a lie or empty theater to also be, simultaneously, a calculated move to keep a fragile negotiation off balance and keep global oil markets nervous enough that Iran's remaining leverage retains its value. Both things can be true. Iran's security establishment can genuinely be building toward the kind of asymmetric global reach Nagdi described. And that same establishment can also understand precisely what a headline like this does to a barrel of Brent crude and to the confidence of American negotiators sitting across a table in Doha or Muscat. Reading this as purely a security threat misses half the picture. Reading it as purely posturing misses the other half. So where does that leave the assessment 6 months into a war that has already killed thousands, wounded tens of thousands, reshaped the leadership of a nuclear-armed regional power, and now produced a formal doctrine statement aimed at the American homeland? It leaves us with a real, sourced, multiply-confirmed statement from a senior Iranian military official describing a shift toward offensive operations beyond Iran's borders, made at a moment when the man technically in command of the country that issued it is wounded, largely unseen, and reportedly leaning on the very institution that just made the announcement. It leaves us with a second official threatening infrastructure in terms broad enough to be alarming and vague enough to be more posture than plan. And it leaves us with a diplomatic process that was already fragile before this week, now visibly more fragile after it. Before getting to that honest answer, it's worth walking through how American officials and outside analysts tend to actually evaluate a statement like this one, because the process is different from how it gets consumed online. And understanding that process is what separates informed viewers from panicked ones. Intelligence assessments of doctrine statements generally sit on a spectrum from stated intent to demonstrated capability to specific actionable planning, and each step up that ladder requires a different, higher standard of evidence before analysts treat it as an operational concern rather than a political one. Nagdi's statement on its own sits firmly at the stated intent level. It tells you what Iran's military leadership says it wants to be able to do. It does not, by itself, tell you whether the capability to do it exists yet, and it certainly does not tell you whether any specific plan against any specific target has been drawn up. Analysts watching this war have consistently noted that Iran's public rhetoric throughout this conflict has tended to run well ahead of its demonstrated battlefield capability, particularly regarding claims about missile production rates and the durability of its arsenal, claims that outside estimates have frequently assessed as exaggerated for domestic morale purposes. That history is a reason for real caution before assuming this doctrine statement reflects an imminent operational capability rather than a stated ambition, still years from being fully realized, if it ever is. It's also worth being honest about what would actually need to happen for a threat like this to move from doctrine to something concrete enough to change how ordinary people should think about their own safety. It would require evidence of actual operational planning, not rhetoric. Things like disrupted plots, arrests, or specific intelligence assessments naming targets, timelines, or operatives. The kind of detail that, when it has existed in this war, has generally been confirmed relatively quickly by Western law enforcement or intelligence agencies, rather than left to circulate solely through state television translations and social media threads. As of this recording, no Western government has publicly confirmed any specific plot tied to this week's doctrine announcement. That absence does not mean nothing is being tracked quietly. It does mean that, for now, this remains a story about stated Iranian military policy and the fractured leadership issuing it, not a story about a confirmed imminent attack. The honest answer to whether Americans should expect an operation on domestic soil in the near term is that nothing in the public reporting supports that as an imminent event. What the public reporting does support is a Revolutionary Guard command structure that has spent 6 months absorbing losses, watching its formal head of state remain wounded and hidden, and using that vacuum to entrench its own authority over how Iran responds to a war it did not choose to start, but has chosen, repeatedly, not to end quietly. An institution in that position announcing a shift toward offensive doctrine is not a bluff to be dismissed, and it is not a countdown clock to be feared on a specific date either. It is a data point, one more piece of evidence that the balance of power inside Tehran has shifted away from a wounded man in hiding and toward the generals now speaking in his name. And that shift, more than any single threat aimed outward, may end up being the detail that determines how the next 6 months of this war actually unfold. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, because it's the thread that ties the personal story to the strategic one most directly. Every government needs a name at the top, a face, even an absent one, that its own machinery of state can point to as the source of legitimate authority. Mojtaba Khamenei is currently that name for Iran, and by every credible account available, he is also a badly wounded man, communicating through handwritten notes, kept away from even his own senior commanders for security reasons, unseen by his own public for going on 6 months. A supreme leader in that condition is not necessarily powerless. Written authority, once granted, still carries institutional weight inside a theocratic system built around obedience to the office rather than scrutiny of the man holding it. But a leader who cannot be seen, cannot be easily reached, and increasingly appears to be leaning on the same military institution now speaking in his name, is a leader whose personal authorship of a major doctrine shift is genuinely difficult to verify from the outside, and arguably difficult to verify from parts of the inside as well. That uncertainty is not a minor footnote to this story. It may be the actual story. A powerful, angry, well-armed institution operating with real autonomy inside a state whose formal head is wounded, hidden, and increasingly a symbol more than a decision-maker, is in many ways a more volatile situation than a fully functional government making a calculated, centrally authorized strategic pivot. Calculated pivots can be negotiated with, deterred, or reversed through the normal channels of diplomacy and pressure. An institution consolidating power in the name of an incapacitated figurehead answers to a different set of incentives entirely, ones that don't necessarily respond the same way to the kind of off-ramps that have, however imperfectly, kept this war from spiraling completely out of control so far. Watch what the Guard does next, not just what it says. In 6 months of this war, the gap between Iran's declared policy and Iran's actual behavior on the ground has told the real story almost every time, and there's no reason to expect that pattern breaks now. Keep watching the Strait, keep watching Doha, and keep watching for whether Mojtaba Khamenei, 6 months wounded and still unseen, ever actually appears to speak for himself.